Thank you all for joining us today to talk about how to design the best home energy efficiency and electrification rebates programs possible. This is the third webinar in our series. This one is about the crucial partnership between utility regulators and state energy offices. Can we go to the next slide, please? Before we get started, a few housekeeping announcements. We are recording this webinar and we will be making that recording as well as our panelist slides available to registrants within probably early next week. They're also going to be posted on the ACEEE website. To ask a question during the webinar, please put it in via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And then we are going to get to those Q&A questions, or those questions and answers during our Q&A section after our panelists all go through their presentations. You can also upvote your questions on that Q&A section so that will help us prioritize which questions to go after first during our Q&A section. And you can, of course, chat with one another via the chat function at the bottom of the screen as well. Next slide, please. So why are we here? This is, as I said, the third webinar in a weekly 4-part series, which goal is to support state energy offices, local governments, and other stakeholders in getting the roughly $8.8 billion that are rebates that are funded by the Inflation Reduction Act to those who need it most. Each week's webinar has been and will continue to focus on a different aspect of how best to leverage this funding. And out of this series, we hope that you will come away with concrete, actionable recommendations to ease your implementation of the rebate programs, ensure public involvement and engagement, and deliver benefits to families, workers, and communities in your state, especially those who need it most. Next slide, please. So, to the meat of the matter. Again, this is the third webinar in this series. This one is all about the role of utility regulators and what state energy offices and those utility regulators need to be keeping in mind and working on to ensure maximum impact for this once-in-a-generation funding opportunity. We are going to get started with Peter Florin, who's going to tell us about how the Tech Clean California program is already leveraging and braiding funding from different funding streams to ensure seamless program delivery across the state of California. So in other words, exactly what we want the IRA rebates to do and how we want them to work. So he's going to kick us off by giving us a real life example and telling us things that SEOs and regulators need to keep in mind when designing IRA programs. Then we're going to have Lacey Tan from RMI talk to the specific items that regulators need to keep in mind, work on, to enable their regulated utilities to design and deliver the most impactful IRA programs or programs that braid with IRA funds possible. And then we're going to dive into the weeds. We're going to have Aaron Cosgrove of NEEP talk to us about savings attribution policy, and Nate Kinsey of Utility API is going to talk about utility data access policy. So yes, some weedy stuff, but some very important weeds that we need to get right in order to ensure maximum impact for the IRA funds. So with that being said, I will pass it to Peter Florin of Energy Solutions.
Hello, everybody. Thanks again for joining. Again, I'm Peter Florin, the Tech Clean California Implementation Manager. So really my role on this program, Tech, is to oversee anything that has to do with getting units installed in residential homes. So today, as Alejandra mentioned, I'm going to be providing some program design and layering insights gained over the last couple of years of running the Tech initiative. Next slide. Before diving into the insights, I'll give a very brief overview of tech and the incentives portion before diving into general lessons learned on incentive design, and then some specifics on incentive layering. Next slide. So what is TEC? TEC is a large program. It's California's flagship heat pump market transformation initiative aimed to put California on a pathway to achieve its goal of 6 million heat pumps by 2030. And yes, that is a mouthful there. The program initially launched in June 2021, and then we rolled out statewide incentives in December of that year. TEC is definitely a unique program in that it's given significant latitude to try out various approaches, all with the goal of informing the future of California's decarbonization effort. And for anyone who wants to know more about tech in general, I encourage you to visit our website at techcleanca.com. We have recordings from our previous stakeholder meetings, and that's where you can find a lot of data coming out of the program. Next slide. One more, please. So there's a lot going on in tech, and we have it bucketed into these three high-level buckets. The first one is spurring the market through statewide strategies. This is where I'll be bringing my perspective from. This is where our incentives sit, contractor training, consumer education. Then in the middle, we have a pillar talking about pilots. So it's testing small-scale efforts on a regional basis to figure out what is scalable. And then all of it is built on a foundation of data collection and analysis to determine California's long-term building decarbonization framework. So again, a lot going on in tech, but today I'll just be primarily focusing on the incentive side. Next slide. So brief overview of the incentive structure itself. It is a contractor-driven program, so we pay incentives directly to contractors with forced flow down to end-use customers, meaning end-use customers have to realize the benefit, but we pay the contractors directly. Eligible products, so it's a retrofit-only program supporting non-heat pump to heat pump conversions. It's currently a flat incentive structure, meaning it is consistent statewide. We originally had a structure in single family that varied by region, but have since then simplified it. Installation requirements are limited only to those of local code requirements. And then, as Alejandra mentioned, we have set up our application system to be able to layer multiple program incentives via a single claim form. And I have lots of lessons learned about how that's done. Then on the current results, so again, we launched initially on December 7th, and actually the first round of incentives ran out on May 2022, since relaunched then. But over the last couple of years or so, we've had 700 individual participants, 30,000 units installed across multifamily and single family, and accounted for about $40 million of incentives paid. So it's definitely a significant set of installation data that I'm leaning on to put together these insights. Next slide. One more. So getting into the general incentive design considerations, again, these are just some considerations to keep in mind for any incentive design before I get into the layering. While I did try to make these fairly universal, some of the structure was based on tech being really extremely flexible, so definitely keep that in mind. And I am going to breeze through these fairly quickly. You'll have the slides afterwards if you want to dig into some of these in more detail. But I broke the findings down into the following categories: product and installation requirements, incentive rates and budget structures, data collection requirements, customer qualification, and then process considerations. Next slide. And then before I dive into each of those, I wanted to start off with what I consider to be the top three incentive design components. First off, program must be simple. Many times these programs are trying to divert normal practices, and the more complex the design, the less likely someone will participate because it just takes more time. There's administrative work to participate in these. Our first iteration of incentive rollout was far too confusing, and it led to a lot of unhappy participants. We have since then simplified things on the HVAC side, and participants have applauded these changes, in fact, calling tech one of the more effective programs in the market. Second is program stability is absolutely critical for market transformation. Stops and starts wreak havoc on an effort because it doesn't allow for the necessary support structures to effectively grow to support the effort. Tech experienced this stop and start, and while we're doing a decent job at retaining participants for round two, there's definitely just kind of a shadow over it where participants are concerned funds will run out again. Then lastly, this is also still tied back to number one, where we learned about simplicity. Getting feedback during the design phase is critical because it ensures the program will swim in line with how the market operates versus trying to push upstream. Again, I recognize what we're trying to do is divert normal practices, but you have to recognize how things are done today to build a program that can effectively land. Next slide. So then starting off with product and installation requirements, a lot of this is really going back to number 3 on that previous list, getting that feedback from the market. So on the product side, it's really important to talk to manufacturers and distributors to find out what is readily available in the market now or what can be. When we relaunched single family HVAC incentives in April of this year, we did outreach to distributors to hear what products they had in stock as we were actually considering raising our efficiency levels to match that of the IRA tax credit requirements. And overwhelmingly, what we heard was that distributors were well stocked with code minimum units and that the IRA efficiency levels were really unachievable by the vast majority of products available. So really, we made the decision to keep it at code minimum because it is impossible to get large scale participation if you are trying to push efficiency levels of products that just aren't available in the market. And then again, on the other side, consider program goals and layered programs when setting requirements. So for that, because tech is all about fuel switching, getting the heat pump in the door is paramount. And so we just chose to keep it at code minimum to remove any unnecessary barriers that may not exist. A program focused on energy efficiency, though, would set higher efficiency standards. On the installation side, tech is currently just setting our install requirements to match that of local jurisdiction. For us, this means permits must be pulled, and for HVAC, HERS testing must be completed. But we aren't setting anything beyond that, as from our perspective, AHJs, authorities having jurisdictions, have already determined what needs to be completed to meet code requirements. So we didn't feel the need to unilaterally make other judgment calls. Next slide. Then getting into incentive rates and budget structures, there's a lot that goes into setting incentive levels, and these are just some 3 specific consideration. The first one is universal. The second 2 are way more focused on the fuel switching side. So first off, it is absolutely critical to maximize incentive rates with program lifetime. Again, I mentioned during my top 3, having a stable program is critical. During the first round of tech incentives, the funds evaporated in 6 months due to high incentives coupled with high demand. And while participants loved these higher rates, they passed on feedback that they would rather the rates are lowered to ensure a longer running program. There's obviously a break-even point where the incentives are too low, but this is where outreach really comes in. So we went out there, talked to contractors, find out what that break-even point was, and set the incentive right about that point. And then specifically for fuel switching projects, again, both of these points are probably obvious, but fuel switching projects typically have higher appliance and installation costs. So it's important to consider the total install cost when looking at fuel switching based incentive programs. And then fuel switching installations likely have longer timelines. There's probably more electrical work or something that needs to be done. And so to that end, you really want to consider setting the incentives higher than just the incremental cost difference between the like for like or the fuel switching project. Because as the project gets more complex, you need a little bit more of a financial push to get the customer to make that ultimately tough decision. Next slide. So then on the application data side, so this is where kind of what information you are collecting to confirm if an application is valid or not. And for this, I go back to the number one program design consideration, simplicity. While we recognize that collecting data through these programs is critical, every new application field is an exponential increase in effort on the participant side, especially if it is data they do not normally collect as part of their process. These folks, the folks in tech program, the contractors, they're in the field all the time doing installs, and they don't want to have to go back to their office and sift through paperwork to find a single number needed for a claim. So in general, these are just some questions that we ask ourselves when we set the data collection parameters for the application. And it is a constant battle to find what is that sweet spot to ensure we are collecting enough information, but not putting undue burden on the participant. Next slide. And then last but certainly not least are participant and process considerations. For participants, we understand that not everyone will qualify for any given program, but there needs to be a very easy way to determine if they do. For example, tech in the first round was built on zip code validation. This latest round is fully statewide, so that makes it very easy. But for the first round, participants could just type in the customer's zip code and it would tell them whether or not they qualified. And this all has to be set up to be done at the kitchen table so the salesperson can give the customer that 100% confidence before they leave that they qualify. Then on the process side, incentives need to be paid quickly, especially if you're paying someone like the contractor who cannot afford to be out significant money for too long. During the first round, it took us about 8 to 10 weeks to pay, and that was far too long and it caused significant pain points. And since then, we have way slimmed down and improved our process, and we are paying within about 2 weeks. And it's been shown that keeping the money flowing is really, really critical to retain happy participants. Next slide. And then one more. So from here, I'll go into some considerations for incentive layering side. So that was more about just general program design advice. This is specifically on layering. There is a lot that goes into layering. And for today, I'm really just going to be focusing primarily on the application side, kind of how to layer two programs together. But beyond that participation, there's outreach and education, lead generation, and lessons learned and information dissemination. So this will definitely just be one piece of the puzzle with layering. Next slide. So during the first round of tech incentives, our goal was to encourage layering wherever possible. To support this, we redeveloped our application system to be able to take in a single claim and apply multiple incentives to it. So we are able to, as Alejandra said, braid together multiple funding streams to create the maximum amount available for a participant. And we leverage the update of our application system to set up a few forms of program integration models that you can see here. The first one is the most integrated, meaning a participant submits a single claim to apply for both the tech and local utility program, and this is managed 100% by a single entity and thus the most streamlined. In the middle is option 2. There's still a single application, but payment comes from two parties. And this is really the best option if you need to split up who receives the incentive. So it's still fairly streamlined with that one application, but you're just splitting the incentive between different parties. The third is more of a back-end coordination. And I'll go into why I don't suggest this option. We have actually dropped this from our offering. It involved data sharing in the back end to help streamline participation, but it really broke down at scale. So the first option is the preferred one far and away because it is the most simple for the participant to manage. Next slide. And so then getting into some specific considerations that we have learned to date. First off, the program rules need to have extremely minimal variation wherever possible for programs to be layered effectively. And this idea is broken down further to application data, equipment eligibility, and customer qualifications. On the application side, data needs to be closely aligned because that means the participant isn't required to submit two discrete sets of data to meet the needs of the layered programs. To support this, tech is pulling back on the number of application data points to ensure that if layered programs have specific needs, it doesn't lead to an avalanche of requirements. For measures and equipment eligibility, they just need to be able to layer and stack easily enough. So since tech just has code minimum requirements, it makes it very easy to stack EE programs on top of it. It becomes really confusing to manage for a participant, though, if they are choosing between products and one may meet the goals of one, but not the other, and they're choosing another one that may meet goals of the other program, but not the first one. So it really needs to be able to have a very easy way to ensure that the product they select will qualify for all layered programs. Then on the customer qualification, this is less important to be aligned, but I go back to my previous point on this, where there needs to be a very easy way to confirm which programs they do in fact qualify for. Then on the incentive kind of budget organization side, if possible, incentive budgets should be set to nimbly adjust incentive structures or fill in gaps to ensure a seamless participation. We actually had a couple instances where setting the budgets up this way has come in really, really in handy. So tech initially ran out of funds in May 2022, and one of the layered programs we worked with was able to swiftly update their rates from the program, so participants actually had the same amount available to them before and after tech ran out of funds. Then more recently, that same program ran out of budget, and we were able to leverage some of tech funds to cover the incentives for jobs that just missed the window. Keeping participants happy is paramount, and we are able to do that just by gap filling. I recognize this is not necessarily an option for all programs out there, but if given the flexibility, being able to nimbly fill in gaps is really important consideration. Next slide. And these are my last three before I hand it off here. Consider program goals when designing layered incentives. Layered programs work best when they have different but complementary goals. For example, in regions where we were layered with a program focused on high efficiency installations, we saw installs tend towards higher efficiency products. And again, this may seem obvious, but it was a pretty stark difference when we were not working with a higher efficiency based program. It definitely tended more towards code minimum. So really speaks about the importance of considering how the goals of the two programs work together. Next, this is an important one. Layered programs must be built for scale. As shared at the beginning, we had a ton of participation, and at that level, the third option of integration broke down. So we swiftly threw it out as an option. So really, it's important to build the process for the maximum scale you could expect, and then expect more on top of that. And then last but certainly not least, both regional programs and statewide or federal programs have equal roles to play. We saw that in areas with a local program, we saw more participation, and one region in particular saw a 500% increase in participation after the local program started. And these regional programs help support more participation through ideas such as strong on-the-ground community support and engagement. Not everyone is going to catch wind of these programs automatically, and many are likely to trust a more local rep. And so having someone in their backyard promoting the program helps increase the likelihood that local residents will really pay attention. And then also there's regional variation in install costs. So having a layered incentives allows for the maximum amount to recognize potentially those higher costs for that given region. So again, I know I flew through these. I saw a couple of questions come in, but at this point, I will hand it off to Lacey Tan with RMI.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone. My name is Lacey Tan. I'm a manager at RMI on our carbon-free buildings program. Today, I'm going to discuss the actions that regulators can take to support successful implementation of IRA building incentives as we coordinate with state energy offices, utilities, program implementers, and community-based organizations. Next slide. Okay, real quick, for those that don't know RMI, we are an independent nonprofit organization of experts that we work across multiple disciplines to accelerate the clean energy transition and improve lives for all. So we work with individuals, corporations, communities, foundations, government leaders, you name it. Next slide. Okay, so we know, as you probably know, IRA is the largest investment the federal government has ever made in the U.S. energy system. So it really has the potential to change the game in terms of the pace at which the U.S. decarbonizes, which we know we need to speed up a little bit. So IRA includes new and improved clean tax incentives. It also unleashes powerful new tools and creative programs that put end-use customers at the center of decarbonization. It opens a door for leadership across stakeholders in this space. So as state energy offices prepare to direct billions of dollars in this federal funding from the IRA to improve efficiency in residential and commercial buildings, thoughtful and robust coordination between state energy offices and utility energy efficiency programs are needed to really maximize the benefits for households and businesses. So with all these new opportunities, we need to rethink the utilities and the regulators' role in fostering more equitable outcomes, such as reducing energy burden and increasing electrification, which will in turn have really positive health impacts for everyone. Next slide. Okay, so where are my regulators at? Regulators are in the driver's seat to spur action on IRA. I mean, absent regulatory action, we could really miss out some great benefits for ratepayers and communities. And so what we're seeing is that regulators have a multitude of potential avenues to mandate and or oversee utilities implementation of IRA. And given that every state context is different, it's important to think about the specific regulatory frameworks in which you work and how IRA could integrate into existing efforts, be complementary to programs that are succeeding or proceedings that already exist. So this slide shows the major impacts of IRA on electric utility regulation, but I'm really just going to focus on the regulatory actions that can be used to maximize the benefits and integration of the home electrification and efficiency rebates and incentives, as well as tax credits. Next slide. Okay, so let's dig into this. Let's talk about programming implications of energy efficiency, electrification. So program impact number one, design energy efficiency programs that support rapidly growing building end-use electrification. I mean, that's the whole goal, right? We need to support it. So one of the implications here is you should review existing landscapes and rules. You know, we want to roll these programs out integratedly, quickly, effectively as possible. So simple procedures should be developed, such as evaluating overlapping utility and state programs as an integrated package. We should also think about what exists, particularly rules or procedures, how you're aligning with things, especially around fuel switching, saving attribution, and data accessibility. Another really key thing here is we're going to have new capacity constraints, right? So support demand response programs. As we electrify, many states' loads profiles will change. Some states may go to a dual peaking. Some will shift from a summer peak to a winter peak. As such, it's clear that demand flexibility will be a valuable resource to manage load and ensure that electrification spurred by IRA helps states meet its decarbonization goals without further straining the grid. And I cannot emphasize this enough. A joint approach to energy efficiency and electrification is absolutely critical. Another consideration is new rate design. I mean, electrification has to be cost effective, and it's only going to be cost effective to the extent that opportunities for energy conservation and savings are leveraged simultaneously, but not just from this macro level, but also the micro level as we think about bill impacts for electrification for households and businesses. And lastly, customer outreach on IRA. You know, we need to ensure that the energy efficiency measures are deployed in conjunction with electrification, and that all of these actors, the state energy officers, the regulators, utilities, the contractors, that we collaborate to braid the funding from complementary programs. Next slide. Program impact number two. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, but opportunities to address equitable decarbonizations through low to moderate income specific programs. It's critical that states create standards and practices and requirements for the consideration and implementation of programs that will hopefully result in equitable outcomes. LMI and disadvantaged communities are disproportionately unable to access financing credit that can make the uptake of individual IRA credits a feasible proposition. They're also about 2/3 less likely to participate than, you know, a non-LMI or disadvantaged participant. So as such, we see opportunities for utilities to fill the gap between IRA's individual credits and weatherization retrofits that these customers will likely need, as well as the financing needs that they may face. This will likely require dedicated low-income utility programs that are tailored to meet the needs of these customers, offering things like on-bill financing opportunities, perhaps supported by regional or national green banks. And another thing we really, really need to think about here is stranded assets. Where gas utilities are present, utilities may need to be required to ensure electrification and the shift away from gas is occurring equitably and not just concentrated amongst those who have the disposable income to finance the full cost of the transition. And finally, we know that reaching these customers in this community is more challenging, and so it's going to take a very thoughtful and concerted, tailored effort. Utilities should collaborate with community-based organizations and their equity advisory groups to develop more comprehensive approaches to marketing programs that are tailored to LMI and disadvantaged customers. Next slide. Okay, so program impact number 3. Support interagency coordination with utilities to streamline and leverage the benefits of IRA. So I've emphasized this a lot throughout this conversation, how important coordination between the utilities, state and federal agencies will be, and likewise, coordination between commission and state regional efforts. So I just want to pull it to the fore here. State energy offices across the country are likely going to begin, if they have not already, concerted efforts to coordinate across these siloed programs and establish what we call a one-stop shop approach for customers. And if they don't do that, they will likely be considering how to coordinate planning and deployment for many existing and newly funded programs. So utilities, as a customer engaging organization, have an opportunity to align their efforts with the state agencies and support state agencies with eligible households and business identification and targeting, data, etc. And finally, I just want to say, coordination for coordination's sake will achieve nothing. There needs to be some accountability put in place and some guardrails to make sure that what's happening, those efforts are done appropriately and that you're seeing the outcomes that are what we'd like to see, right? That they're responsive and effective. Next slide. So I just wanted to give 2 examples of what's happening with IRA on programs rate making. In Minnesota, the PUC has an order requiring utilities to maximize the IRA in planning, rate making, and demand side plans. So this is really exciting, and they're getting started right now on this. And then in Hawaii and Michigan, the PUCs have building staff capabilities to respond to federal funding opportunities. So they have some dedicated FTE because it's a lot of work. And so these are some great examples of a few actions that are already in place to support IRA. Next slide. Lastly, I just wanted to mention RMI has a comprehensive report that goes into greater details and covers a wider range of regulatory actions that are beyond electrification and the incentives for efficiency that I just want to encourage you all to read. Next slide. And that's it. Thanks so much for your time. I'm going to pass it over to Erin Cosgrove from NEEP.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lacey. My name is Erin Cosgrove. I am Senior Manager of Policies and Programs at NEEP, or the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships. Next slide. Before I dive into my topic, a little background about NEEP. So NEEP is a Regional Energy Efficiency Organization, or a REO, and REOs actually operate to help states within our own regions accomplish energy efficiency and decarbonization goals through highlighting success stories, convening working groups, and providing technical assistance. Next slide. And today I'm going to be talking about the super wonky topic of attribution. Before I dive into this topic, I want to highlight that if you liked the Clean Tech platform, this is definitely something that your state energy or the Regulatory Commission is going to have to talk about. And this also kind of builds off program impact number 1 that Lacey was talking about, aligning energy efficiency programs with the IRA programs. So first I'll dive into what attribution means. So attribution is actually the practice of determining which entities or which programs received receive credit for reductions in energy usage, and by extension, the monetary energy savings. So who gets to count the savings when we're actually operating energy efficiency programs? And this is important for IRA because for homes, savings have to be reported to DOE, but we also know that many states have existing energy efficiency programs where utilities have mandates, and there might be an issue with the IRA programs competing or operating in the same space as those mandates. And so this can impact utilities, especially if they have performance incentives, saving goals, or something called an energy efficiency resource standard. And so with IRA and utility spending and the braiding of programs, it becomes even more difficult to distinguish between which of the two programs cause the customer to participate, which utilities are mandated to prove sometimes for their efficiency programs, and also which program was able to engage and drive the consumer to actually start the program. So for example, if IRA rebates are third-party implement, utilities could perceive them as competition, and this could lead to lower performance in regards to their energy efficiency programs without coordination. And if they partnered or coordinated explicitly with state energy offices, utility program administrators could actually help IRA funds go further by leveraging their existing administrative networks and their program knowledge. And then finally, I kind of just wanted to highlight that determination of attribution and how it's decided right now. It happens in negotiations between utilities and PUCs prior to energy efficiency programs starting. So we're hoping that this also kind of sheds a little bit more light on the process and allows for it to be kind of more streamlined, or a framework that can be used universally instead of decisions kind of made one-off. Next slide. So NEPA has actually been convening a working group to kind of tackle this issue around how we handle attribution with IRA programs and energy efficiency programs. So today I'm going to walk through kind of the top issues we've identified, and then I'm going to provide a draft of what our framework is. And I'll just also highlight that we hope to have a white paper out that states can use to reference in the end of December that tackle this issue. But so the 4 questions we've really focused in on and that matter when it comes to IRA attribution is what reporting requirements exist for DOE, what programs need the attribution or credit for the measure, and what programs are there to kind of provide support. What do states want to pursue or to gain from these IRA programs and existing programs they have on the ground? And then finally, what kind of impact will the attribution decision have on regulatory mandates for utilities, especially when it comes to energy efficiency programs? Next slide. So first, I'll just give a quick level overview of DOE reporting requirements. There's a lot of text on this page, but there's really 2 big takeaways that are important to kind of tease out. First, DOE has released some recommendations for evaluation. Everyone should take a look at them if you are interested in this. But what they have included is that for evaluation purposes, states may include multiple programs in their statewide evaluations, provided reporting is done separately. So what that means is states have to report separately saving achieved per transaction for homes and widget replaced for here, but states are allowed to combine these programs together and evaluate them with existing on-the-ground programs. And then the other important thing to highlight is DOE recommends that states actually work with existing programs to maximize the ability for the existing programs to count savings for braided projects. So that means that that DOE wants to see states braid and consider ways to leverage IRA funds to grow additional savings in their existing programs and expand the reach of existing programs. Next slide. The next question we kind of tackled is what program actually needs the attribution savings? As you can see here, I've given a rough hypothetical of what different programs might be available in a state. We have utility programs that are regulated in the utility regulatory space and have to be reported through that venue. You have state climate emissions, which could be state programs that have to track their DHG emission reductions. And then you have the federal IRA rebates. That could be utility or third-party implementers that have to track their impacts. But I think the main takeaway is utilities are actually mandated to accomplish goals. So we really need to focus on how we want to measure and assign the attribution in that space. And then also projects can exist in all three of these spaces and can be measured in all three of these spaces without leading to double counting. So it's just an important kind of framing, thinking about who gets credit and how credit can be distributed. Next slide, please. And then we also wanted to highlight, and this is an extensive list, what do states want to gain from braiding IRA rebates with utility programs? Utilities have a lot of knowledge on the ground from their previous energy efficiency programs, but in some states, maybe regulators would like to see some modifications to programs. And there's a list here that we have seen, or we think states can consider discussing with utilities when it comes to attribution and braiding programs. I won't go through them all, but I also included a link to the utility, the ACEEE utility scorecard, which I believe will also provide on-the-ground examples of some of these initiatives that could be pursued, such as fuel switching, equity-centered programs, and also ensuring administrative support and customer engagement and outreach. Next slide. And then the final question we want to ask is, what kind of impact will attributing savings and the spending to utilities have on regulatory mandates that utilities have? And I'll quickly just give an overview of the 4 spaces we think this might impact. First is goals. So regulators might need to adjust targets that utilities have with their energy efficiency programs to drive more savings. They also might need to consider if utilities don't have goals that line up with homes or HERE. HERA is electrification focused. Homes is savings focused, and sometimes utilities operate for efficiency, but not necessarily for electrification. They also will need to consider how the goals are created, if they're in law or if they're done per cycle. Benefit cost tests should be looked at to make sure they're not eliminating programs by being put on the IRA rebates, but at the same time, if benefit cost analysis are part of performance incentives, they could be disproportionate if IRA rebates aren't accounted for. Finally, for performance incentives, you might just want to consider additional performance incentives to encourage the braiding of funds or to adjust the performance incentives upward. And then for spending, some states have restrictions on spending for their energy efficiency programs. And then also state PUCs would want to make sure that spending is additional and spending is not cut down from attribution. Next slide, please. And with all of that background, I'll say that we have come up with 4 frameworks for states to think through attribution. And we'll have a paper out in December that will break down these frameworks. But how we see it is states can approach it through kind of a sliding scale of how much attribution they would like to, or how much attribution and therefore coordination they'd like to see utilities, starting with no attribution, in which case everything would run separately. And also we'll explore the ramifications of that on the valuation process as well. And then we propose a partial attribution model that looks at the proportional spending to achieve savings. And then what we're also calling a partial attribution model that has a tiered attribution, where states could ask for or require certain things such as X amount of spending, leveraging marketing from utilities in order to receive an amount of attribution, and then full attribution to utilities. And what we'll do there is also dive into some examples of where that has occurred and how regulators have leveraged or also used the full attribution to braid programs together and to make sure that they are able to actually be better all around because of that coordination. And so with that, next slide, I will just say that my email is up. If you want to talk attribution, please feel free to reach out. We will be working on this for the next month, and I'd love any feedback. And I will pass it to Nate Kinsey from Utility API.
Thanks, Erin. Good afternoon, everyone. Big thanks to Alejandra, ACEEE, and others that are hosting this webinar series. My name is Nate Kinsey, VP of External Affairs, Utility API. Utility API is a company that's on a mission to unlock data and unleash the clean energy revolution. Next slide, please. So I was asked really to talk at a very high level around the different types of arrangements, kind of contractually, that enable data access for program implementation. So in the simplest format, you have this kind of first bucket here of just utility program. This is a program implementer has a direct contract with an individual utility And as part of that, they really gain access to their customer data set, or at least have some mechanism of requesting that data set in bulk or at an individual level to implement their program. And that includes processing rebates, doing the MMV, etc. This next category is utility data sharing tools. Many on the call have maybe heard of Green Button Connect, the industry standard for data sharing. Well, utilities across the country have been required to build out data sharing tools that meet the Green Button Connect requirement, and where programs, contractors can individually request access to customer data and receive authorization using those tools. Under this bucket of utility data sharing tools as well is really important work done with partnership with Energy Star and Energy Star Portfolio Manager to build out a way of accessing whole building data for multifamily implementation. And a number of utilities have built out tools there. This third category is the centralized state data repository. And this is really a new kind of place where data and data access is coming to the marketplace. Leading states like California and New York have really taken steps and passed orders and policies to grab a hold or centralize a lot of the utility data in the state and utilize that to do things like better forecasting, data sharing, etc. And finally, you have data access platforms, which is, for example, utility API is a private place where contractors, program implementers, etc., can come and utilize a variety of different software tools to access data on an individual basis across the country and in different utility programs. One click for me. Most importantly, across all of these kind of categories of how we do data access and enable data sharing between customers and programs and contractors, all of these can enable program participation in a state. And so if you're a state energy office, you have to think through what are the different existing programs that are operating, the existing contractual arrangements, and really try to think through, okay, what is the minimum viable product or access to data that I need to enable a program participation. And that's just like submitting a rebate, processing that rebate. One more click. These four categories are kind of tools and arrangements also can enable measurement and verification. So as Aaron accurately pointed out, as part of the HOMES program, the DOE has established a requirement that savings numbers actually be reported back to DOE on unclear at an individual level or an aggregate level, but regardless, the program has to report back the amount of savings that's being generated. And that requires access to data. I think all of these can be different tools that are required to collect that data, analyze that data, and do that reporting. And final click on this slide. But most importantly, I want to call out here, and what a lot of folks have been talking about in the industry is doing customer targeting, whether that's for low income households, households that will generate the most savings. Customer targeting is really only applicable or doable in situations where a state energy office or program implementer holds a contract with the utility or with a centralized state data repository. This enables them to have access to kind of a bulk set of data for a utility's or a state's entire customer base that will then allow them to do the filtering and the targeting that is necessary to achieve the state's goals. This is great. It's aspirational. Many of us want to do that kind of work, but I want to caution everyone to not get stuck there. There are ways to access the data and these tools that are laid out here to enable your programs to get going, to start doing the measurement and verification and the reporting that are required, and then build in the customer targeting as you work through different arrangements with your utility and or kind of the centralized state database. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide for the day. I just want to hammer home three quick things. When thinking about working with PSCs or PUCs on this topic, you can get really lost in the weeds and the wonkiness very quickly, but three things are very important. One is that states affirm for the first time or reaffirm that customers own their utility data. This most importantly enables a customer to share that data with the program implementer, the contractor that's implementing the program. But this affirmation has not been done across all 50 states. Most recently, New York in an order reaffirmed that customers own their data. I think it's actually a pretty logical and sensible place considering all the other data types that we have out in the industry and the economy. So getting that across the finish line with PUC or PSC in the states really important. Second is supporting existing tools, re-supporting existing tools, and investing in new data sharing platforms and tools. Like I mentioned, the industry has done a lot of work to invest in Green Button Connects, Energy Star Portfolio Manager integrations. Some of those work really well and some of them don't. But we need to continue supporting those investments. They can be critical tools to enable the kind of simple program implementation that Peter was mentioning earlier on, and trying to streamline as much of as possible the pathway to participation. And then finally, it's really important that stakeholders have a place in a venue, the regulatory or at the commission, to discuss the ways we're going to enable this data access. Lacey brought up the highlighted, I think it was Minnesota, that actually has a docket that is specifically looking at IRA programs. That's great. And my interpretation so far is that's really a lot of front of the meter stuff. It's not necessarily how do we enable the homes and HERA implementation at the state level? How do we tackle this tricky topic of data access? What are the arrangements we're going to adopt from a data access contractual perspective? So whether that's the ongoing energy efficiency docket, an electrification docket, it's just really important that PUCs and PSCs figure out a place to have these conversations and for stakeholders to work together. Next slide. So again, quickly, just wanted to jam through some data access stuff. Here's my contact information, and also happy to answer questions here. But good luck with all of that, and turn it back over to Alejandro.
And now I am unmuted. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I want to invite all the panelists to come off mute, like it took me a second to do. Thanks for sharing all of that great information. We only have about 10 minutes left. I'll dig into the questions. This one I believe was meant for Peter, but I suspect that potentially Aaron and Lacey also have thoughts on it. For rebates in California, how did you handle the change in operating costs, i.e. for those switching over from gas to the electric bill?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And first off, I actually want to share that most customers who received HVAC incentives through tech did experience lower bills. So every customer who received a tech incentive, we are running their meter data through meter analysis to determine kind of the pre-post impacts. And so a lot of HVAC customers experienced savings. Water heater customers, it was a mixed bag quite a bit. So there definitely are some that will experience slightly higher bills. And so I do want to reemphasize the point that Lacey made about the importance of rate changes to really support this long term. But we really aren't running from the fact that some customers may have higher bills at all. But for some of the areas of the program where kind of customer cost, there's more sensitivity to bill changes, we are definitely taking a more targeted approach. So identifying home characteristics, previous heating source characteristics for customers who are more likely to have a chance to save, and really doing outreach to those specific customers. The market rate program is open to everybody. And yeah, like I said, we're just not running from the fact that some may experience slightly higher bills. But again, most actually saw bills go down through our analysis.
Anything to add from Lacey or Aaron? Okay, then I would add that just to reiterate the importance of rate design, and that's a piece that the utility, the regulators are of course key in. I think there's two paths or two pursuits that we need to be taking. One is sort of the immediate rate that we make available for people that switch over, especially LMI customers. Considering special protective rates for the folks that we want to lead the transition with, but are most vulnerable. And then really long-term rate reform in terms of ensuring that as we head towards the fuels of the future, we are putting the utility system costs in the right buckets so that we are not making it hard for people to transition to the cleaner fuels available to them. Next, back to my list of questions. A question here about sort of the specifics. I'm going to try and combine the specifics of the tech program design. What eligibility factors are you including in your program? IRA, income eligibility rules, are float as a possibility? And then also sort of with that, can you give more details about what pieces you eliminated from the initial tech rollout that streamlined the program?
Yeah, so I'll start with that second question first. So initially on the single family side, we had what we called a baseline and enhanced structure. Whether a territory was baseline or enhanced was solely dependent on if we had a program that was formally layered with us. So initially our outreach was all around trying to really encourage that layering. And so we built a structure to encourage that layering, but it created a kind of a Swiss cheese model where you'd have two regions side by side with vastly different rates available to them. And that just became really complicated for participants to know, you could have a neighbor with one rate, but the house that they're in would get a different rate. And so really that we took away that model just to create that simplicity side. And then for eligibility requirements, so this latest round of tech, we are blessed to have it be a fully statewide program. So there are no customer requirements as long as they are within the state of California, they qualify. Then on the income eligibility side, so we do have some more income qualified programs. I do not have them on the top of my head, but I believe the income qualifications we set were aligned with those of the income qualifications for the IRA rebates. Again, I don't have that off the top of my head, but I believe that's the case. But again, really easy qualification here within the state of California. You meet the kind of general customer requirements for tech.
And then it seems the questions are putting Peter on the spot. I'll close with, can you please share a little bit more about why length of time of program design was identified as a key parameter for market transformation, now, for example, efficient distribution of programmatic dollars?
Absolutely. So we like to talk about incentives coming and going as kind of a sugar crash. There's a lot more that has to be built up around an industry to ensure a sustained adoption. One kind of real example, our trade schools need to revise their curriculum to better align with the goals of the market transformation initiative. That is a long-term effort, and having incentives be there and be stable really sends a signal to all of those supporting activities that they can go into kind of driving towards those new goals without having fear that the rug's going to be pulled out from under them.
Nate, anything to add on the sugar crash?
No, I think it's correct. Longevity and stability in the rebate sector is really important for successful program implementation and market transformation. So, and I think Peter and the tech team learned that, right? And then was able to gain access to a broader, more flexible set of funding. So encourage states to think about that, right? They're, in the scheme of things, we're not getting a lot out. It's a lot, it's a historic investment, but at the end of the day, the market transformation we need is going to require more than what's being pushed to the states.
Great. So with that, I think I'm going to close. Thank you everybody for joining, for asking your questions. Feel free to reach out to the panelists with any follow-up questions. And thank you, of course, to the panelists and the sponsoring organizations for making this information sharing possible. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.